New dreams on Old Boot Lake. Thanksgiving was approaching, but before holiday meals and gatherings could claim our attention, another opportunity had arrived, one that had many of us talking for months. The state of Alaska was opening portions of what people were calling the Green Acres program. For folks like me, it was an exciting prospect. The idea of owning a remote piece of Alaska wasn't just about property. It was about possibility, a place to build a cabin, a place to hunt, fish, trap, or simply spend time with family. In a state as vast as Alaska, having a piece of country to call your own carried a certain appeal. Daryl and I had already spent considerable time looking at different areas. Now it was time to get serious. On November 29th, we flew into the Old Boot Lake area. Flying over that country always gave me a different perspective than traveling it by snow machine. From the air, the lakes looked like scattered mirrors frozen into the landscape. The spruce forest stretched endlessly between ridges and valleys, and here and there small meadows broke the dark timber. The country looked wild, untouched, exactly the kind of place that attracted people like us. By the time we landed and unloaded our gear, the daylight was already beginning to fade. Winter days in Alaska don't waste much time. Daryl looked around and smiled. "What do you think?" "I think we're going to do a lot of walking." He laughed. That turned out to be true. The next morning we began studying the land in earnest. We weren't simply wandering around looking for scenery. We were evaluating, measuring, comparing, trying to imagine where future cabins might stand, trying to picture what the land would look like not just today, but 20 years from now. The state required specific measurements and setbacks from shorelines. Everything had to be done correctly. As we worked, I found myself becoming increasingly attached to the area around Old Boot Lake. There was something about it. The shape of the shoreline, the surrounding hills, the views, the feeling of the place. Some spots speak to you. This was one of them. Kurt was supposed to fly us again the next day, but weather and scheduling didn't cooperate. That was simply part of life in Alaska. You learned patience. You learned flexibility. Eventually, Kurt flew me to Tulsona Lake, and I drove home. The planning wasn't finished. Far from it. But the dream was beginning to take shape. A few days later, winter reminded everyone who was in charge. I was heading toward the trap line when traffic ahead suddenly slowed. A van had stopped in the road. The people inside had spotted caribou in the distance and decided that was reason enough to hit the brakes. The car ahead of me managed to avoid them by sliding into the ditch. Unfortunately, by the time I realized what was happening, there wasn't enough room left. I bumped the other car's bumper. Not a serious accident. Nobody hurt, but it completely ruined my schedule. By the time everything was sorted out, I no longer had enough daylight to make the run to the cabin. That evening, I sat at home, slightly annoyed with the entire situation. Sylvia listened patiently. "Well, let me understand this." "What? You got delayed because somebody stopped to watch caribou?" "Pretty much." She smiled. "That's a very Alaska problem." I had to admit she was right. Several days later, another storm rolled through. Heavy snow, 6 inches overnight. The roads became challenging in a hurry. One afternoon, I came across Lloyd Ronning's pickup sitting helplessly in a ditch. Lloyd stood nearby, looking less than impressed. "Need a pull." What gave it away? Within a short time, we had him back on the road. Helping neighbors wasn't something people thought much about. You simply did it. The day might come when you needed the same help yourself. On December 4th, I finally headed back toward Old Boot Lake. The snow was much deeper now. I loaded the snow machine and drove to the trailhead before starting the long ride in. The difference from only a few weeks earlier was remarkable. Snow covered everything. The machine climbed and descended through drifts that seemed determined to stop me. At times, the powder flowed ahead of the machine like water. Coming downhill was especially interesting. The snow would pile and roll 6 feet ahead of the skis. I remember watching it and thinking, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. Getting stuck would have meant a lot of digging. Fortunately, I managed to keep moving. By the time I reached camp, Daryl and his dog Rufus were doing fine. Their temporary home was a military surplus winter tent. Not luxurious, but effective. A wood stove kept it surprisingly comfortable. After supper, we sat around discussing property lines and cabin sites. The lantern light flickered softly against the tent walls. Outside, the temperature continued dropping. Inside, plans for the future grew steadily larger. The next several days were spent measuring, walking, pacing, calculating, studying maps, looking at shorelines, evaluating possible building locations. The work sounds tedious on paper. In reality, it was fascinating. Every rise offered a different view. Every stand of timber suggested a different possibility. One day we climbed to a higher area and stopped. The view stretched across several lakes. Snow-covered spruce forests rolled away toward distant hills. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Daryl said, "Not a bad place for a cabin." "No, not bad at all." We both knew we were imagining future buildings standing there, with smoke rising from chimneys. Boats pulled up on shore in summer. Snow machines parked outside in winter. Dreams often begin with a view. The country itself was alive with signs of wildlife. Caribou tracks crossed nearly every open area. Moose tracks appeared along the edges of timber. Fox signs showed up here and there. One day we found where a ptarmigan had dived into the snow to spend the night. The snow acts like insulation. Beneath the surface, it can be surprisingly warm. Nature has a way of solving problems, often more efficiently than we do. Daryl wasn't feeling especially well by then. Neither of us knew exactly what was going around, but both of us seemed to be fighting something. That didn't stop the work. We simply moved a little slower. Then came one of the saddest moments of the trip. Daryl's dog Rufus died. Rufus had been a good dog. Quiet. Dependable. The kind of dog that becomes part of camp life so naturally that you hardly notice how much you appreciate him until he's gone. Daryl took it hard. I understood. Anyone who has spent enough time with good dogs understands. The bond becomes stronger than many people realize. We decided to bury Rufus on Daryl's 40-acre parcel. The ground was frozen and digging wasn't easy. The work took time. Neither of us talked much while doing it. The winter woods seemed unusually quiet that afternoon. When we finished, Daryl stood looking at the spot for a long moment. He liked it here. Yeah. He always liked being outdoors. I nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Eventually, Daryl spoke again. Seems right. It does. The wind moved gently through the spruce trees. Snow sparkled beneath a pale winter sun. Rufus would remain there, part of the land Daryl hoped one day to call his own. It felt fitting somehow. Years later, that memory would stay with me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was real. Life and loss travel together, even in beautiful places. The following day, we continued our measurements. We carried 100-foot steel tape through the snow, measured shoreline, marked corners, cut lines through the timber, placed stakes, flagged boundaries. By evening, my 40 acres had begun taking shape on the ground instead of merely existing on paper. That was a satisfying feeling. The dream was becoming tangible, something a person could stand on, something he could point to, something he could someday pass on. As darkness approached, we gathered firewood and prepared for one more cold night. The stars emerged overhead. The temperature dropped quickly. Inside the tent, the stove glowed red. Daryl and I talked about future cabins, about fishing, about retirement someday, about projects we'd probably never finish. The kinds of conversations men have when they're tired, comfortable, and looking toward the future. On December 12th, Chris arrived just before dark. The landing strip we had packed on the lake worked perfectly. Watching a plane appear in the winter sky always felt remarkable to me. One moment, there is only wilderness. The next moment, an aircraft appears, connecting that remote place to the rest of the world. Chris flew Daryl out. I loaded my gear and headed for the trail with an empty sled behind the snow machine. The work at Old Boot Lake was essentially complete. At least for now. The claims had been measured. The boundaries marked. The dream established. That evening, back among friends, there was a sense of accomplishment. The sort that comes after hard work. No celebrations with fireworks. No grand speeches. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing progress had been made. The next morning I rested. My body appreciated the break. The following day, I unpacked Green Acres gear and began preparing once again for the trapline. Winter doesn't pause for long in Alaska. One job finishes. Another begins. That was simply the rhythm of life. Looking back now, I realize those days around Old Boot Lake were about more than staking land. They were about hope, about imagining a future about seeing possibility in a stretch of wilderness and believing something meaningful could be built there. For people who choose frontier life, that belief matters. A cabin begins as an idea. A trail begins as a direction. A home begins as a dream. And out there among the frozen lakes and snow-covered spruce, Daryl and I were dreaming. Part 5, Thanksgiving, deep snow, and the long walk home. Before our trip to Old Boot Lake, there had been one event that stood out among the ordinary routines of November. Thanksgiving. For most of our lives, Thanksgiving had meant family gatherings in Minnesota. There would be crowded tables, children running through the house, relatives arriving with casseroles and pies, and enough food to feed an army. Living in Alaska changed some of those traditions, but it didn't lessen their importance. If anything, it made people appreciate them more. On Thanksgiving Day, Sylvia and I joined friends and neighbors at Nelchina Lodge. The weather had been cold and clear, and by the time we arrived, pickup trucks were already lined up outside. The lodge windows glowed warmly against the early darkness. Inside, the smell hit us immediately. Turkey, ham, fresh rolls, gravy, pumpkin pie, coffee. The unmistakable scent of a holiday meal. Now that's a smell I recognize, I said. Sylvia laughed. You'd recognize it from 2 miles away. Probably. The dining room was filled with familiar faces. People who had become our Alaska family. Pilots, hunters, mechanics, homesteaders, teachers, families with young children. People who had arrived from all over the country and somehow found themselves building lives together in this corner of Alaska. One of the things I always appreciated about frontier communities was how quickly they adopted people. Most of us were far from where we had grown up, far from parents, far from brothers and sisters, far from old friends. So we became family for one another. That Thanksgiving felt like an example of exactly that. As supper was served, conversations drifted around the room. Stories were exchanged. Jokes were told. Somebody recalled getting stuck with a snow machine 3 winters earlier. Another person told a hunting story that somehow improved every year. The children grew restless waiting for dessert. A few older folks pretended not to notice. Sylvia sat beside me, smiling as she listened. I knew she was thinking about Minnesota, about the children, about the grandchildren, probably wondering what everyone was doing at that very moment. At one point, she leaned closer. I miss them. I know, but I'm glad we're here. I looked around the room. The lodge glowed with warmth. Friends laughed nearby. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Outside, snow covered the country for hundreds of miles. Me too, I said. Later that evening, after most of the meal had disappeared, people lingered instead of rushing home. Nobody seemed eager to leave. In Alaska, during winter, gatherings like that become important. The darkness is long. The distances are great. Time spent together matters. Eventually, we headed home. The northern sky shimmered faintly with aurora. Not a bright display, just enough green light to ripple across the horizon. A fitting end to Thanksgiving. A few days later, I found myself heading once again toward the trap line. Winter had deepened considerably. Snow covered everything. The country looked entirely different than it had only weeks earlier. I had intended to leave on December 1st. Instead, the little accident involving the stopped van and the car ahead of me delayed the trip. The following day disappeared into preparation. Fuel, food, equipment, the usual routine. Then another storm arrived. Heavy snow, 6 inches overnight. The roads became difficult. The trail would be worse. Still, there was work waiting at the cabin. On December 4th, I loaded up and headed in. The ride proved memorable. The snow was incredibly deep. In places, it seemed almost alive. Going downhill, powder flowed ahead of the machine like a white river. It piled and rolled in front of the skis. Every descent felt like driving into a moving wall. More than once I thought about stopping, then quickly decided against it. Getting stuck would have created an entirely different adventure. By the time I reached camp, I was grateful to see Daryl and waiting there. The military tent glowed warmly in the gathering darkness. Smoke drifted from the stovepipe, a welcoming sight after a long ride. After the Green Acres work ended and I returned home, there wasn't much time to rest. The trapline still demanded attention. By December 15th, I was loaded once again and headed toward the cabin. The weather wasn't terrible. The problem was snow. Deep snow changes everything. Trails disappear. Landmarks become difficult to recognize. Travel slows dramatically. For much of the day, I fought my way forward. The machine worked hard. So did I. At one point, I lost the trail completely. I wasn't worried initially. I knew generally where I was. I knew where Blue Lake was. I knew where the cabin should be. The challenge was connecting those pieces. I continued forward. Then things went sideways. Literally. I came over a small ridge and discovered a solid wall of alders. Before I could react, the machine buried itself. I climbed off, tried rocking it free. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. Well, I said aloud, this isn't ideal. The wilderness offered no comment. Then matters became worse. The skidoo wouldn't start. Not even a little. I pulled. Nothing. Pulled again. Nothing. I checked everything I could think of. Still nothing. The machine had apparently decided it was finished for the day. Unfortunately, I wasn't. I cut brush, cleared snow, pulled the starter rope until my shoulder hurt. The result remained exactly the same. Nothing. By then, darkness was approaching. I stood there looking at the machine, then looking toward where I believed the cabin lay, then back at the machine. There really wasn't much choice. I would have to walk. I gathered what I needed, made sure the machine was secure, then started down the trail. At first, there was still a little daylight. Not much, but enough. Soon that disappeared. Darkness settled over the country. The temperature dropped steadily. My bunny boots felt heavier with every mile. The snow absorbed sound. The world became silent. I remember stopping once and looking upward. The stars were brilliant. Thousands of them. Without city lights, the sky seemed almost crowded. Those stars became important. They provided enough light to keep me oriented. Not enough to travel quickly, but enough. I knew the country. That helped. A person who knows the land can accomplish things that seem impossible to someone unfamiliar with it. Even so, it was a long walk, longer than I liked. Every ridge looked farther away than it should have. Every turn seemed to promise the cabin, then didn't. I kept moving. One step, then another, then another. There wasn't much point in doing anything else. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw it. The cabin. Dark. Silent. Waiting. Relief washed over me. By the time I reached the door, it had been several hours since sunset. Once inside, I quickly loaded the stove. Soon flames crackled. Heat began spreading through the room. The familiar smells of wood smoke and dry cabin air returned. I sat quietly beside the stove for several minutes, not doing anything, just enjoying being warm. People who have never spent time in the winter wilderness sometimes underestimate how comforting a simple cabin can be. That little building wasn't luxurious. It didn't need to be. At that moment, it felt like the finest hotel in Alaska. The next morning, I returned to retrieve the snow machine. Fortunately, daylight makes almost every problem seem smaller. The machine looked considerably less intimidating than it had the night before. I dug, pulled, cut more brush. Eventually, I freed it. Then, almost as if embarrassed by its previous behavior, it started. One pull. Just like that. I stared at it. Now you start. The machine remained unapologetic. I rode back toward the cabin, shaking my head. Machines have personalities. I'm convinced of it. Some of them simply enjoy creating stories. That afternoon, I checked portions of the trapline. At last, a bit of success. A nice marten. Not a fortune. Not even close. But enough to improve my mood. A trapper appreciates small victories. I also managed to get myself temporarily lost. Something I generally tried to avoid. The deep snow had altered familiar landmarks, and before long, I found myself coming out near Old Man Lake instead of where I intended. Fortunately, I recognized my mistake quickly. No real harm done. Just another reminder that wilderness country deserves respect, no matter how well you think you know it. By December 17th, I was back home. There were supplies to unload, errands to run, equipment to repair, normal life waiting once again. Sylvia greeted me at the cabin. How to go? Depends. On what? Whether we're talking about the trapping or the walking. She laughed. That bad. Let's just say the cabin looked really good when I finally got there. She poured coffee while I told the story. By the time I finished, she was shaking her head. She said, most people would consider that a good reason to stay home. Probably, but not you. No. She smiled knowingly. After all these years, she understood something important. The trapline wasn't simply about trapping. The country had become part of me. The lakes, the ridges, the cabin, the winter trails, the challenge, even the hard days, especially the hard days. Those experiences became stories. The stories became memories, and the memories became a life. As Christmas approached, snow continued falling across the Alaska wilderness. The darkest days of the year were arriving, but so was one of the warmest seasons. Soon friends would gather. Lights would appear in cabin windows. Meals would be shared. And for a little while, even in the deep Alaska winter, the world would feel smaller and brighter. Part 6. Christmas at Taslina. By the time Christmas week arrived, Alaska had settled into its deepest winter mood. The light was short now, barely a few hours of pale daylight if the sky was clear. Most days were a soft gray, with snow drifting in slow, quiet patterns through the trees. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys and disappeared quickly into the cold air. Inside the cabin, life felt smaller in a good way. Simpler, warmer. Sylvia had been busy in her own way, turning the cabin into something that felt more like a home than a work base. Curtains had been adjusted, shelves cleaned. Things that had drifted into temporary storage during my summer and trapping seasons had been quietly relocated into places that made sense again. I noticed it one morning when I went to find a coffee mug. You've reorganized the entire kitchen, I said. I have not. I opened a cupboard, then another, then paused. Then what do you call this? I call it finding things. That's not what it used to be called. She smiled without looking up from what she was doing. You're welcome. I had no argument strong enough to win that one. The truth was, I liked it that way. It felt like the world had been put back into order after a long stretch of living out of balance. Christmas was going to be spent at Taslina Lodge. That was where people gathered that year, and as the day approached, word spread quickly. In a place like this, holiday plans aren't made through formal invitations. They happen through conversations at the gas pump, over coffee at the store, or in passing along the road. You come into Taslina for Christmas? Wouldn't miss it. Good. Bring something if you can. That was about the extent of it. On the morning we left, the temperature sat well below zero. The kind of cold that makes everything sound sharper. Boots on snow, truck doors closing, even voices outside. Sylvia wrapped a scarf tighter around her neck as we loaded the truck. You think there'll be a lot of people? She asked. There usually are. Do they all bring food? Most of them bring something. And what do you bring? I thought about it. Usually appetite. She laughed. That seems consistent. The drive to Taslina passed through familiar winter country. Snow-covered spruce lined the road like silent sentinels. Occasional tracks crossed the highway. Moose, sometimes caribou, sometimes just the faint imprint of something that had passed during the night. By the time we reached the lodge, the place already had that holiday feeling. Cars and trucks were parked in uneven rows. Lights glowed in the windows. Smoke drifted from the chimney. And voices, lots of voices, carried out into the cold air. Inside, warmth hit us immediately. Not just heat from the stove, but the warmth of people gathered together. There were hugs, handshakes, and greetings from every direction. Norman, Sylvia's back. Merry Christmas. Coffee was already on. Somebody had a pot of stew simmering. Another table held pies and baked goods that looked like they had arrived from half the kitchens in the valley. Sylvia slipped into conversation almost immediately. That was something I always admired about her. She didn't need time to adjust to people. She simply joined in. Within minutes, she was talking with a group of women near the kitchen, catching up on news from the summer, listening to stories, laughing at something someone said about a frozen water line. I found myself near the stove with a cup of coffee in my hands. Dan was there, along with a few others. Someone handed me a plate without asking. Food's over there. I noticed. Don't wait. I wasn't planning to. That seemed to satisfy everyone. Christmas gatherings in places like Taslina were never overly formal. There might be a moment when someone said a few words, maybe a toast or a short reflection, but mostly it was about being together. People came and went throughout the afternoon. Children ran through the building in bursts of energy, that only Christmas seems to produce. Someone brought out a guitar. At some point, a small group began singing. Not professionally, not perfectly, but sincerely. Sylvia came back over at one point and sat beside me. "You look comfortable," she said. "I've found the food." "That explains it." She looked around the room. "It feels good in here." "It does." There was a pause. Then she said something quieter. "I'm glad I came back when I did this year." I nodded. So was I. Later in the afternoon, the conversation drifted into stories of the year. There were hunting tales, equipment breakdowns, storms, small victories, and losses remembered quietly without needing much explanation. Someone mentioned a moose that had been taken earlier in the fall. Another talked about a snow machine that had finally given up after too many winters. These weren't dramatic stories in the way outsiders might expect. They were just life, shared experience. A few of us ended up talking about Green Acres and the Old Boot Lake country again. That project had captured a lot of attention. "It's good land," someone said. "It's real country," I answered. Sylvia listened quietly while I spoke, and I could tell she understood more than she let on. She had started to see what that kind of land meant to people like us. It wasn't just property. It was future. It was possibility. It was something to build on when everything else in life felt temporary. As evenings settled in, the lodge grew warmer and more crowded. Outside, darkness came early. Inside, it didn't matter. Someone started handing out small gifts for children. Nothing elaborate. Socks, small toys, candy, things that had been gathered and wrapped in the spirit of the day rather than purchased in any organized way. Home isn't always about where you were born or where you spent most of your life. Sometimes it becomes the place where you are known, where you are part of things, where you don't have to explain yourself. As the night went on, people began to leave in small groups. Some headed out early to feed animals or tend wood stoves. Others stayed until the very end, reluctant to let the evening go. Eventually, Sylvia and I stepped outside. The cold hit like a clean wall of air. The sky was clear now. Stars filled it completely. No wind, just stillness. The lodge behind us glowed warmly, voices still faintly audible through the walls. Sylvia stood beside me for a moment, looking out across the snow-covered ground. "It's quiet," she said. "It always is this time of year. I like it." We stood there for a while longer. No hurry to leave. No need to speak. Just the sound of winter. Then she said something quietly. "I think I understand why you come back out there." "You mean the trap line?" "Yes. I thought about that. It's not always easy. I didn't think it was. And it's not always comfortable. I figured that too." She turned slightly toward me. "But it makes sense to you." "Yes." She nodded. "That it makes sense to me." That was enough. On the drive home later that night, the world felt larger again. The road stretched ahead through dark country. Occasional snowflakes drifted through the headlights. Sylvia leaned back in the seat. "Long day," she said. "Good day." "Yes," she agreed. "Good day." After a while, she added, "Do you ever think about Minnesota this time of year?" "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" "The people." She nodded. "I think about them too." That night, when we finally got back to the cabin, the stove was still warm from earlier. I added wood and listened to it catch. Sylvia hung her coat and sat down near the table with a cup of coffee. For a long time, neither of us said much. Outside, Alaska winter stretched in every direction, cold, quiet, and endless. But inside, the cabin was warm, familiar, occupied, alive, and in a way that was becoming clearer with every passing year. So were we. Not visitors, not newcomers anymore, just people living a life that had taken root in a very different kind of soil. A life built on wood smoke, snow machines, shared meals, hard days, good friends, and long winters. A life that didn't always make sense from the outside, but made perfect sense from inside a warm cabin on a cold December night. This concludes our episode for this week. If you're enjoying the story and would like the books this story is based on, go to 10,000daysinalaska.com for more info. It is available in both paperback and ebook. A new episode of this series will air next Saturday morning, so be sure to come back as our story continues.